A millionaire's wife humiliated a black CEO with wine. Minutes later, she lost everything. Hello everyone, before we begin today's video, I need your help. We've noticed that the channel is losing traction, and subscribing is one of the best ways you can help us. It's quick, free, and allows us to continue bringing you great content. Your support means everything. Let's keep this channel growing collectively. Where are you watching from? Drop your city or country in the comments below. Thank you very much. Now, let's get back to the story. Get out of here. The words weren't shouted. They didn't need to be. They cut through the grand dining hall like a blade dragged slowly across crystal. The woman in the champagne-colored gown was laughing as she said it, her head tilted back slightly, one manicured finger pointing forward as if she were directing a joke that everyone else was expected to enjoy. In her other hand, a half-full glass of deep red wine caught the light of the chandeliers overhead. And then she tipped it. The wine spilled forward in a deliberate arc, soaking the front of the man standing beside the table. It bled into the pale pink fabric of his tailored shirt, blooming dark and unmistakable across his chest. Gasps fluttered through the room. Then laughter followed. Nervous at first. Curious. Hungry. Phones rose almost instinctively, sleek black rectangles lifted to capture what the room had decided was entertainment. A humiliation, dressed up as humor. A correction, delivered in public. The man didn't move. He stood tall among the white tablecloths and polished silverware, one hand resting casually in his pocket, the other holding a phone to his ear. He didn't look at the woman. He didn't look at the wine staining his shirt. He didn't look at the people watching. He listened. The woman stepped closer, emboldened by the attention. Her smile widened, sharpened. "You people always wonder where you don't belong," she said, her voice dripping with amusement. "This isn't a place for mistakes." Her friends laughed. Someone clapped softly. A man at the next table leaned back in his chair, grinning as if he'd paid for front row seats. The man on the phone finally lowered it slightly, just enough to glance at the screen. His expression didn't change. No anger. No embarrassment. Just calm. Measured. Almost distant. The wine continued to drip from his shirt, dark drops landing on the marble floor with soft, echoing taps. Each sound seemed louder than the last, filling the sudden pauses between chuckles. Before we continue, where are you watching from? Drop your city or country in the comments below. And if you believe in dignity and justice, hit like and subscribe. These stories spark change. And we're glad you're here. Now, back to the story. A server hesitated nearby, frozen between instinct and fear, tray trembling in her hands. No one moved to help. No one spoke up. This room had long ago learned the rules of survival: don't challenge wealth, don't interrupt cruelty when it wears confidence like perfume. "Security," the woman called out lightly, as if ordering dessert. "Please escort him out before he stains anything else." The word "him" landed heavier than the wine. Two guards at the far end of the hall exchanged a look but didn't step forward yet. They were waiting for confirmation, for permission, for the room to agree on what reality was supposed to be. The man finally ended his call. He slipped the phone back into his hand, glanced down once more at the ruined shirt, and exhaled slowly. Not in defeat. In acknowledgement. Around him, the laughter thinned. Something subtle shifted, like a pressure change before a storm. The chandeliers still glittered. The orchestra continued softly in the background. But the air felt tighter now, heavier. He looked up. His eyes met the woman's. For the first time since the wine had left her glass, she faltered. Just for a second. Because what looked back at her wasn't hurt. It was calculation. It was the steady gaze of someone who had made decisions far more devastating than this room could imagine. He said nothing. He didn't raise his voice. He didn't defend himself. He simply turned slightly, angling his body away from her and toward the exit, as if granting her the illusion of victory. Behind him, the guests relaxed again, convinced the moment was ending the way these moments always did. The powerful humiliate. The room moves on. The story disappears into gossip. No one noticed his thumb moving across his phone screen. No one noticed the single message sent. No one noticed that the man they had just laughed at wasn't leaving in shame. He was leaving the room exactly the way he'd entered it. In control. And none of them yet understood that what they had just witnessed wasn't the end of an embarrassment. It was the beginning of a collapse. Her name was Catherine Whitmore, and in that room, the name carried weight. It moved waiters faster. It softened the voices of other women. It made men laugh a half-second earlier than they otherwise would have. Catherine was the kind of woman who never questioned her place in the world, because the world had been arranged around her long before she was old enough to notice. She was born into comfort, married into money, and perfected the art of mistaking privilege for authority. The wine she'd poured hadn't been an impulse. It had been a statement. She stood there now, glass empty, chin lifted, basking in the afterglow of attention. Around her, the room slowly returned to motion, chairs shifting, forks clinking, whispers beginning their quiet migration from table to table. "Unbelievable," she said lightly, brushing an invisible speck from her dress. "Honestly, these events attract anyone these days." Her friends nodded, eager to realign themselves with the dominant energy in the room. One woman leaned in, lowering her voice but not her smirk. "You did what everyone else was thinking," she said. "Some people just don't know their place." Catherine smiled at that. She liked when people said place. It implied order, structure, control. To her, the man in the stained shirt hadn't been a person. He'd been a disruption. A flaw in the aesthetic. A reminder that money could buy access but not legitimacy, at least, that's what she believed. She had spent her life enforcing invisible boundaries. Who sat where? Who spoke when? Who belonged in the photos and who stayed just outside the frame? Tonight was no different. The gala itself was personal. This wasn't just another charity dinner. It was her husband's night. Richard Whitmore was a millionaire by inheritance and reputation, the kind whose wealth lived more comfortably in conversations than in liquidity. He stood across the room now, surrounded by investors, laughing too loudly, working too hard to appear relaxed. This evening mattered. The donors mattered. The optics mattered. And the people who didn't matter were supposed to stay invisible. That was the unspoken rule Catherine had enforced with a smile for decades. She glanced toward the exit, expecting to see security escorting the man out already. When she didn't, irritation flickered behind her eyes. "What's taking so long?" she muttered. One of the guards had stepped forward but stopped again, uncertain. That hesitation annoyed her more than the man ever had. Authority, in Catherine's mind, worked best when it was immediate and unquestioned. She turned back to her table, lifting a fresh glass as it was offered to her. "Honestly," she said, laughing again, "you try to do something nice for the community, and this is what happens." Across the room, a few guests were still filming, their interest slowly fading as the moment seemed to resolve itself the way these moments always did. The man had walked away. The embarrassment belonged to him now. The room could move on. That was the assumption. Catherine didn't notice her husband's smile tightening. She didn't notice the subtle shift in his posture. She didn't hear the sharp intake of breath from one of his advisors who had just checked his phone. She was too busy enjoying the comfort of familiarity, the belief that power protected its own, that money smoothed over cruelty, that consequences were for other people. She raised her glass. "To standards," she said, her voice carrying just far enough. A few people echoed the toast. None of them yet understood that the standards Catherine believed in were about to be applied to her instead. The man stepped into the corridor just beyond the dining hall, where the sound of laughter softened into a dull, distant murmur. The doors closed behind him with a muted click, sealing the room and its assumptions inside. He stopped. For the first time since the wine had touched his shirt, he looked down. The fabric was ruined. Not cheaply ruined, not carelessly ruined, but unmistakably marked. The red had soaked deep, spreading slowly, deliberately, as if claiming territory. He studied it the way an engineer studies a fault line. Calm. Analytical. Curious. He brushed the cloth once with his fingers. The stain didn't move. That was fine. He lifted his phone again, the screen glowing softly in the dim hallway. The call he'd been on earlier hadn't been dramatic. No raised voice. No urgency. Just confirmation. Yes, he said quietly now. A pause. Proceed. That was all. He ended the call and slipped the phone back into his hand, resting it loosely at his side. His breathing was steady. His shoulders were relaxed. Nothing about him suggested a man who had just been publicly humiliated. Because he hadn't been. Humiliation only worked on people who believed the room defined them. He had learned that lesson a long time ago. Years earlier, in offices far smaller and far colder than this one, he had been ignored, underestimated, talked over. He had learned to let people finish laughing before making decisions that would outlast their voices. He had learned that restraint wasn't weakness, it was leverage. Behind the closed doors, the gala continued. Glasses clinked. A joke landed. Applause rippled briefly and then faded. Inside that room, Catherine Whitmore was still smiling. He adjusted his cuff with one smooth motion, a habit ingrained through repetition. The watch beneath it caught the light for a moment, subtle, unbranded, the kind worn by men who didn't need recognition to know its value. He began walking. Not toward the exit. Toward a side door that led deeper into the building. A staff member noticed him and froze, uncertainty flashing across her face. She opened her mouth to speak, then thought better of it. Something in his expression stopped her, not threat, not arrogance, but certainty. He passed without a word. Every step was unhurried. Intentional. In his mind, the evening replayed not as an insult, but as data. A confirmation. The room had shown him exactly what it was willing to tolerate. Exactly who it was willing to protect. Exactly how quickly dignity was traded for comfort. That information was valuable. Far more valuable than the wine-soaked shirt. He reached a quiet alcove overlooking the city, floor-to-ceiling windows framing the lights below like a map of small, flickering systems, each dependent on another, each fragile in ways most people never noticed. He typed a single message. No explanation. No emotion. Just instruction. Somewhere across the city, phones would begin to ring. Emails would be opened twice to be sure they were real. Meetings scheduled weeks in advance would suddenly lose their purpose. Inside the ballroom, the orchestra would keep playing for a while longer. And Catherine Whitmore would continue believing the man she'd dismissed was already gone, walking away with his embarrassment neatly folded inside him. She would not realize, at least not yet, that he hadn't left the building. He had only stepped aside long enough to decide how much of it would still be standing by morning. What no one in that ballroom understood, what not a single laughing guest had paused to consider, was how fragile the evening truly was. The Whitmore name carried social weight, but its financial spine was thinner than it appeared. The wealth Catherine wore so comfortably was not liquid. It was layered. Deferred. Dependent. The gala wasn't just a celebration. It was a performance staged to reassure the room and, more importantly, reassure the lenders that everything was still under control. It wasn't. Richard Whitmore had been smiling all night because smiling was cheaper than panic. Behind the scenes, his empire was strained to its limits, propped up by expectations and a deal that had not yet closed but was already being spent in his mind. This dinner was the final act before relief. The investors knew it. The advisors knew it. The banks knew it. The only person who didn't seem to understand how precarious the moment was his wife. Catherine believed power was inherited and enforced socially. She believed embarrassment was fatal. She believed that if a man walked out of a room quietly, it meant he had lost. What she didn't know, what she couldn't know, was that the man she had dismissed wasn't a guest. He was the variable. The Whitmores had spent months negotiating with a consortium that insisted on anonymity. No photos. No dinners. No introductions. Lawyers spoke to lawyers. Documents moved through intermediaries. The name on the contracts was clean, distant, deliberately unremarkable. That anonymity had been interpreted as weakness. Someone with nothing to prove. Someone grateful for access. It never occurred to them that privacy could be a choice. At a corner table near the stage, one of Richard's advisors glanced down at his phone again. His brow furrowed. He read the message once, then again, slower this time. "Is something wrong?" Richard asked, still smiling, still playing his part. The advisor hesitated. "Probably nothing," he said. "Just, unexpected." Across the room, Catherine was laughing again, recounting the moment with animated gestures, already reshaping it into a story where she was decisive and righteous. "He didn't even argue," she said proudly. "Just walked away." A few people nodded. Someone murmured approval. Only one man near the bar didn't laugh. He had gone pale, his eyes fixed on his phone, fingers trembling just enough to notice. He looked up. And for the first time that night, fear crept into the room. Because what was happening now had nothing to do with wine or decorum or social hierarchy. It had to do with leverage. With signatures. With decisions made quietly, far from chandeliers and applause. The kind of decisions that didn't announce themselves. They simply arrived. A vibration rippled through the tables as more phones lit up. Conversation slowed. A laugh died halfway through a breath. Someone excused themselves abruptly and didn't come back. Catherine noticed the shift but misunderstood it completely. She straightened, assuming the attention was returning to her. She had no idea the room wasn't watching her anymore. It was waiting. Waiting for confirmation. Waiting for numbers. Waiting to see which direction power would fall. And none of them yet realized that the collapse they feared hadn't started with a market swing or a missed payment. It had started the moment Catherine Whitmore decided a man didn't belong in her world. The message moved faster than any rumor ever could. It didn't come with explanation or warning. It didn't need one. On the other end of the city, in offices where lights were still on despite the late hour, screens refreshed. Calendars shifted. A quiet chain reaction began, precise, methodical, irreversible. The man stood by the window, watching traffic thread through the streets below like glowing circuits. His reflection stared back at him in the glass, the stain on his shirt now darker, fully settled. He didn't wipe it away. He waited. Inside the ballroom, the first crack appeared at the head table. Richard Whitmore's phone vibrated once. He ignored it. Then again. He frowned, finally glancing down. His smile froze. The advisor beside him leaned closer, voice low. "We may have a problem." Richard laughed reflexively, the sound thin. "Now's not the time," he said. "We'll talk after the speeches." The advisor didn't smile back. He showed him the screen. Richard's eyes scanned the message. His fingers tightened around the phone. He read it again, slower this time, as if hoping the words would rearrange themselves into something less dangerous. They didn't. Across the room, Catherine was mid-sentence, basking in attention, unaware that her husband's posture had changed. His shoulders had stiffened. His gaze had drifted not toward her, but toward the doors. "Is everything all right?" someone asked him. "Yes," Richard said too quickly. "Of course." Another vibration. Then another. Phones were lighting up now, one after another, like a constellation forming in real time. A banker excused himself. An investor leaned away from his plate, appetite gone. A woman near the orchestra stopped clapping, her smile fading as she checked her notifications. The music continued, but the rhythm felt wrong. Out of sync. Catherine noticed the shift and frowned. "What's going on?" she asked, annoyed. "Did I miss something?" No one answered her. Richard stood abruptly, chair scraping against the floor. The sound cut sharper than the whine had earlier. He turned to his advisor. "Get me confirmation," he hissed. "It's already confirmed," the man replied. "They've withdrawn." Richard swallowed. "Withdrawn from what?" The advisor met his eyes. "Everything." The word landed heavy. Across the room, a guest whispered, "Is it true?" Another replied, "The funding's gone." Someone else murmured, "Effective immediately." Catherine's smile finally faltered. She looked around, searching for reassurance, for the familiar nods and laughs that had always come so easily. Instead, she found people avoiding her gaze. Stepping back. Creating distance. "Richard," she said sharply. "What is happening?" He didn't answer. Because in that moment, the final piece fell into place. He saw the stained shirt in his mind. The quiet exit. The calm. And with sickening clarity, he understood who the man had been. The doors at the far end of the hall opened softly. The man stepped back into the room. No announcement. No spectacle. Just presence. The conversations died mid-word. Heads turned. Phones lowered. The orchestra faltered, then stopped entirely. He walked toward the center of the room, unhurried, every step echoing in the sudden silence. Catherine stared at him, confusion giving way to dread. Richard's face drained of color. And for the first time that night, the power in the room shifted fully, unmistakably toward the man they had all watched walk away. Except now, he wasn't leaving. He was about to speak. Silence spread through the ballroom like a held breath. The man stopped at the edge of the central tables, the stain on his shirt now fully visible under the chandelier light. No one laughed this time. No one lifted a phone. The appetite for spectacle had vanished, replaced by something colder. Recognition. Richard Whitmore stood frozen, his hands still clenched around his phone. His advisor leaned in, whispering urgently, but the words didn't seem to land. His eyes were fixed on the man walking toward him, each step dismantling a belief he had carried for decades. Catherine felt it before she understood it. The room no longer bent toward her. People shifted their chairs away from her table. A woman she'd toasted with minutes earlier suddenly found something fascinating in her napkin. A donor she'd known for years avoided her gaze entirely. "What is this?" Catherine said, forcing a laugh that sounded too loud, too brittle. "Is this some kind of stunt?" The man stopped a few feet from her. Up close, the calm was unsettling. There was no satisfaction in his expression. No anger. Just certainty. "This isn't a stunt," he said quietly. His voice didn't need volume. The room was already listening. "I was invited here for a conversation," he continued. "About alignment. About values. About trust." He glanced down briefly at his shirt, then back up at her. "I got my answer early." A murmur rippled through the guests, sharper now, edged with understanding. Phones buzzed again, this time not with rumors but confirmations. Numbers. Statements. Withdrawals. Catherine's face flushed. You think you can just walk back in here and what? Lecture us, she snapped. You were escorted out. He shook his head once. No, he said. I chose to step aside. That distinction landed harder than any insult. Richard found his voice at last. We can talk privately, he said, forcing calm into every syllable. Whatever misunderstanding this is, we can resolve it. The man looked at him steadily. There was no misunderstanding. He turned slightly, addressing the room instead of the Whitmores. Moments like this are revealing, he said. Not because of what's said but because of what's tolerated. No one interrupted him. No one dared. I watched a room full of influential people decide that humiliation was acceptable as long as it was entertaining, he continued. I watched silence be mistaken for consent. And I watched power assume it would never be questioned. His gaze returned to Catherine. You mistook access for ownership, he said. And presence for permission. Catherine opened her mouth, then closed it again. For the first time in years, she didn't know what to say. Richard swallowed. The deal, he said quietly. We need that deal. The man nodded once. You needed it, he corrected. I didn't. The words settled like ash. Around the room, alliances recalibrated in real time. People who had laughed earlier now studied the exits. Others checked their phones again, already calculating distance, how far they were from the Whitmores, and how quickly they could make it clear. Catherine looked around desperately. This is absurd, she said. You're overreacting. It was just a moment. He held her gaze. Moments, he said, are how systems reveal themselves. He turned away from her then, the decision already complete. Behind him, the chandelier light seemed harsher, the room suddenly smaller. The empire Catherine had believed untouchable was no longer standing tall. It was shrinking. And everyone in the room could feel it happening. The room didn't erupt. It didn't protest. It didn't defend anyone. It recalculated. That was the most terrifying part. Catherine stood motionless, her glass still raised, as if lowering it would somehow confirm what was already happening. Her confidence hadn't shattered yet, it was thinning, stretching, turning brittle under pressure. You're making a scene, she said finally, grasping for familiarity. This is a private event. The man turned back to her slowly. No, he said. This became public the moment you decided to perform. A few heads lowered. Someone near the stage exhaled sharply, like they'd been holding their breath for far too long. Richard stepped forward, panic now breaking through his composure. Please, he said, voice tight. We can fix this. We can apologize. We can make this right. The man looked at him not unkindly, but without sympathy. You're confusing repair with reversal, he said. Some things only work in one direction. He reached into his jacket and removed his phone, holding it loosely, not as a threat but as proof. Every relationship you were counting on tonight, he said, addressing the room, was contingent on trust. And trust is fragile. He paused, letting the silence do the work. It breaks quietly. Across the tables, people shifted again. A donor stood and excused himself without explanation. Another followed. The exits began to look crowded, not with bodies, but with intention. Catherine felt it slipping now. You don't get to decide all of this, she snapped, her voice rising. You don't own this room. He met her eyes one last time. No, he said. I just fund what keeps it standing. The sentence didn't echo. It didn't need to. Richard closed his eyes briefly, as if the weight had finally become too heavy to hold upright. This is over, the man said calmly. Not because of the wine. Not because of tonight. He gestured subtly around them. But because this room showed me exactly who it protects. He stepped back, creating distance, not retreating, but concluding. Security stood frozen, unsure who they answered to now. The orchestra remained silent. Catherine's world, once arranged so neatly around her, had lost its frame. People weren't looking at her anymore. They were looking past her. At what came next. And for the first time in her life, she understood the feeling she had so casually inflicted on others. Irrelevance. The collapse didn't arrive with a scream. It arrived with notifications. Phones buzzed across the ballroom like insects sensing a storm. Screens lit up. Faces drained of color. The same people who had laughed earlier now stared down at numbers they didn't recognize anymore, balances changing, valuations sliding, assurances evaporating. A banker near the back whispered, "They pulled out completely." Another voice followed, sharper. "It's already hit the market." Someone else murmured, "This is spreading." Richard Whitmore stood perfectly still, as if movement might make it worse. His advisors surrounded him now, no longer whispering, arguing quietly, urgently, hands gesturing in tight, controlled motions. Words like exposure, liquidity, defaults floated through the air, stripped of context but heavy with consequence. Catherine watched it all unfold like a foreign language spoken too fast. "What are you all doing?" she demanded. "This is ridiculous. Stop panicking." No one answered her. A long-time donor avoided her completely, turning his back as if she were contagious. A woman she had known for years murmured an excuse and disappeared into the crowd. The room was emptying, not physically, but socially. Connections were being severed in real time. She reached for Richard's arm. "Say something," she whispered. "Fix this." He didn't look at her. Because there was nothing left to fix. The screens near the stage flickered as event staff scrambled, attempting to keep the program moving. But the illusion was gone. No speech could cover what was happening now. No music could soften it. Across the room, the man watched quietly. This wasn't satisfaction. It wasn't revenge. It was consequence. A server dropped a tray. Glass shattered against the marble floor, the sound startling in the tense quiet. No one laughed this time. Security finally moved, not to escort anyone out, but to manage the exits as guests began leaving early, urgency replacing etiquette. One by one, the people who had once defined the Whitmore's world withdrew their presence. Catherine stood alone at her table, her empty glass still in hand. The empire she had believed unshakable wasn't burning. It wasn't exploding. It was unraveling. Thread by thread. Call by call. Decision by decision. And the most brutal part was this. No one was shouting. No one was celebrating. No one was even looking at her. The collapse didn't need witnesses. It only needed truth. He didn't wait for applause. There wasn't any. The man turned away from the center of the ballroom and walked toward the exit, his steps unhurried, measured, as if nothing extraordinary had occurred. Behind him, the room remained frozen, caught between what it had been and what it no longer was. No one tried to stop him. Security stepped aside without being asked. Doors opened smoothly. Courtesy returned, late and awkward, like an apology that had missed its moment. Outside, the night air was cool and still. The city stretched out below, indifferent and endless, lights flickering like distant witnesses that neither judged nor forgave. He paused at the top of the steps and finally shrugged out of his jacket, folding it once over his arm. The wine-stained shirt was still visible beneath it, the mark now dry, permanent. He didn't mind. Some stains were meant to be seen. Behind the glass doors, Catherine Whitmore stood alone. The table that had once anchored her world was half empty now. Chairs pushed back. Napkins abandoned. The laughter that had defined her existence replaced by silence that offered no refuge. Richard sat heavily, his phone dark in his hand. There were no more calls to make. No one left to reassure. The future he'd been leaning on had quietly disappeared. Catherine finally understood something she never had before. Power didn't announce itself. It didn't demand attention. It didn't need to humiliate anyone to prove it existed. Real power simply withdrew and let the absence speak. Outside, the man descended the steps and crossed the street, merging into the flow of the city. To anyone watching, he was just another figure moving through the night. Unremarkable. Anonymous. That was how he preferred it. Tomorrow, headlines would circulate. Analysts would debate. Social circles would rewrite history, pretending they'd sensed the shift all along. The Whitmore name would soften, then fade, then become a cautionary reference spoken quietly at other tables. But tonight, none of that mattered. What mattered was simpler. A line had been crossed. A lesson had been delivered. And dignity, quiet, unshaken, had walked out on its own terms. The ballroom lights dimmed behind him. The city lights did not.